So this talk asks the questions of the power of listening in relation to essayistic and forensic practices of cinema. How can these cinematic practices allow us to see and hear the wounds of environmental and social injustice in the spaces around us? How can we think of cinema not just as an act of viewing, but as an act of listening? And what kinds of knowledge can we access through thinking about cinema as an act of listening? So we will be regarding these questions through the work of the guest that's on the screen, Susan Schuppli, UK-based researcher, artist, professor at Goldsmiths University, affiliated with the very important research collective Forensic Architecture. We are going to see some of her work, specifically the project Listening to Ice, that produces audio-visual evidence with an emphasis on audio as well as visual to expose climate-related injustices. We will also be hearing from Professor Nora M. of Temple University, and if I can manage my motor skills, I can, without breaking any equipment, I can show, oh, thank you. Yes, thank you. I can show the brand new book published by Nora Harun Faroqi, Forms of Intelligence. And we'll be talking a bit about forensic and essayistic practices of cinema pioneered and advanced by Harun Faroqi, one of the most consequential filmmakers and audiovisual artists of the last 50 years. And I'm happy to say that I was a beneficiary of an artist residency by the Harun Faroqi Institute, which was founded shortly after his passing, which allowed me to come to Europe to continue my career, and here I am now in Locarno speaking to you. So I really owe a bit of thanks to the Harun Faroqi Institute and one of its founding members and co-directors, Professor Doreen Mende, who is an associate professor at the HEAD in Geneva. And the Harun Faroqi Institute, just to elaborate, is a research platform that connects the legacy of Harun Faroqi to contemporary practices and politics of the audiovisual, especially through its current project titled Terms and Conditions, the legal dimensions of the audiovisual. How do images and sounds function within legal frameworks that govern our societies and cultures? So that's one thing to consider for this talk as well.
We're just going to start very quickly with a clip. Beforehand, I want to thank Evelyn, Kevin, Sylvia, Libertad, and the entire team here for supporting this event, for coordinating everything, and for your hospitality, as well as for the various institutions that have supported this. And we're on a very tight schedule this evening, so I'll be speaking pretty rapidly, and I'm just going to open this with about a minute and a half clip from a 1966 film by Harun Faroqi entitled Two Paths, or Zwei Wege.
Dieses Schild hier, niegelnagelneu, teilt die ganze Welt in zwei. Das ist so leicht, dass jedes Kind auf dem Tableau zurecht sich findet. Dieses Plakat hängt in Kreuzberg im Geschäftszimmer einer Sekte. Zwei Wege bietet es an, die der Mensch auf Erden beschreiten kann. Den schmalen betritt man durch eine enge Pforte. Er verläuft zwischen Kirche, Sonntagsschule, Kinderrettungsanstalt und Diakonissenhaus. Hat man das christliche Dorf verlassen, steigt der Pfad beschwerlich an. Er mündet in das Reich Gottes. Den ausgetretenen Weg des Lasters säumen Spiel, Hölle, Freudenhaus und Ballsaal. Jede Allegorie ist mit einer Chiffre versehen. Sie lässt sich mit einer Bibel entschlüsseln. Dann hat der Wanderer die Gelegenheit, den Lasterpfad zu verlassen oder seinen Weg durch das Schussfeld zweier feindlicher Heere fortzusetzen. Der Rauch der nachfolgenden brennenden Stadt steigt in die Hölle.
That short continues. It is a short film, but because we have no time, you can check it out on your own. If you want to see it, it's available. So I want to pick up the beginning of my talk a little bit where this morning's session, for those of you who were here, sort of left off with Florian's focus on listening and attention, as well as Erica's discussion about the videographic essay as a form of criticism, the role of ekphrasis, as well as description. And I'm going back to this early film from 1966 by Haroon Farokhi, because it's an example, it's a very early example of where he is taking this image, which is just a commercial image that's located in a bureaucratic office, and he's subjecting it to a very close, meticulous form of analysis, interpretation, as well as visual reading. And it also comes at a time of '66 when he had just published a review essay on Roland Barthes' mythology from 1957. So he reviews Barthes' mythology that came out in '57, publishes it in 1966, and says, I see what Barthes is doing as the future of all forms of critical writing. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is that for Farokhi, as some of you may know, and certainly Volker knows more than anybody else, published continuously. So he had, in addition to his filmic audiovisual output, he also had about over 220 essays and written texts, articles, reviews. And this is really important for sort of my argument, because also the way it ties back into what Erica was talking about earlier, because he really knew that there was a difference between writing about something, describing it in a writerly fashion, and then filming something. So what the audiovisual medium could add. So it wasn't just that got the written text and you have the illustration. He was very attentive and careful not to do that. So early on, when he was working in television, he did two programs that investigated television as a medium, and he was specifically focusing on made-for-television documentaries, a genre that he was both intrigued by but also very critical of. And at one point in his critique, he said, quote, "The images are illustrative. They do not produce but embellish arguments," right? So he was very critical of that, because he said that the whole point is that images, we're not looking at images and we're not listening to images. We're not letting images speak, but rather voiceovers, the way directors have a whole idea, a script in their head, and just say, oh, okay, I just need a bunch of images to illustrate this idea. And he was very critical of that. And he said, you know, the job of a director is to really look at the images, and both in his filming style as well as in the classroom, because he was teaching at the time, he would just replay the same sequence over and over and over again as a way of disembedding the images from the sort of totality of the film in which they were, and really letting the images speak from themselves. He's like, we've got to listen to images and we have to read images. So part of his approach was, in his reading and his looking at images, would have been based in a German Romantic tradition known as hermeneutics, where you just hone in on a fragment. Out of the fragment, you read the whole. Out of the whole, you can read the fragment. Very close interpretation, later found its way into Anglo criticism. It was called close reading, where you really just look very closely at all these details. And that's also, for those of you who can recall Barthes' Mythologies text, that's what Barthes is doing through those series of vignettes. And especially he unpacks one image from the cover of Paris Match of a French a black French cadet saluting the French flag. And he just, I mean, Bach just goes into this meticulous semiotic analysis of this image. So that sort of way of approaching a text is really important from Farocki. And he kind of like always is sort of disassembles a text and disassembles the totality and looks at each fragment. And then we can see this methodology much, much later, almost 50 years later, in The Silver and the Cross from 2010. And it's kind of this, we see it in Images of the World and The Inscription of War from earlier, in Respite of 2007, in As You See. So it's a kind of like forensic examination. And I would argue that, you know, this approach, this forensic approach of really looking closely, we can see this already in this 1966 short. And he was very against the idea that one would just put images together and not pay attention as to how every single image had to have a reason for being there. And he said, you know, it's pretty easy. He said, if you're making a documentary, that you have a drawer full of images that you might want to use. And he said, no, you can't do that. And he said it's sort of a control issue. And about TV documentaries, he says, but because there must be control, one prefers to make images that are dead and mute. You cover them up with the text instead of working on them till they speak. And so what I think we're going to hear later with Schuppli's work, it's all about letting images speak again. So how does one translate, though, his image of reading images, speaking images, into the acoustic? And I have to say, when I was given my assignment for this evening, I was a little bit, you know, sort of taken aback, because I was thinking, but Farocki, he didn't pay that much attention to the actual layerings of of the soundtrack or the text. It was much more focusing on the visual, and he also wasn't that interested or didn't pay that much attention in his work to environmental issues. So it's like, okay, how am I going to relate this? So that's sort of another reason why I'm kind of focusing on this, his methodology, and then trying to translate something which first comes from literature, from art history, into film, then into the sonic realm. And this brings me to some earlier work that I did when I was at one point invited to a video conference in Lüneburg. And at this conference, I can't remember when it was, in the 2000, or maybe 2008 or 10, amongst the participants, we had Farocki, Guido Starl, who was virtually here earlier in the conference, Raymond Bellure, Christa Blumlinger, all these people who had written extensively and thought about the essay film. And I was like, okay, I'm not sure what I'm going to do. And one of my concerns at that moment was that I found that speaking of writing about the essay film was already starting to become a cliche. That people, myself included, who would write about it were saying it's a hybrid mix of fiction and documentary. It's an experiment. It's an essay. It's the introduction of subjectivity. It's between documentary and art. And I was starting to feel like if I hear these phrases one more time about the blend of fiction and nonfiction, I mean, it's just like, it was becoming a cliche, and I felt that my own voice about the essay film was becoming a cliche. So I decided to try to focus just on the acoustics and seeing what I could find. So that was kind of my first experiment into that. And I think that part of what's happening in listening, in reading, and that we have to be really attentive to is, how does one avoid the cliche? Or if one resorts to the cliche, how can you mobilize the cliche, not as a crutch, but kind of as a weapon? How can you bring some kind of force back into topics? How do we listen again? How do we look again? And I think that was something that Faroki was really seeking and attempting to do. So I was also very much guided, as Faroki was too, because he was very much impacted by Godard and influenced by Godard, as we know from Folker's wonderful study on Godard and Faroki, by Godard's phrase in Here and Elsewhere, that in order to see elsewhere, one has to hear elsewhere as well. So that opens up a political space both to listen and to see what has been inaudible or invisible. And with that being said, I think my time is up. It's time to turn to this idea of a forensics, of listening, the work of forensic architecture. I mean, we can also think about Lawrence Abu Hamdam's wonderful work on acoustic forensics, which is almost like this investigative acoustic journalism, but we should turn to Susan's work and her clip.
Susan, would you like to continue to introduce into your work, and can you hear us? Because in order to elaborate on my thoughts, I have prepared kind of a three-part reflection on the work of Susan Schuppli, who has been very important for our work at the Harun Farocki Institute. We've collaborated with Susan Schuppli in various contexts. One of them is a two-part conference that also is published into a book, Navigation Beyond Vision, where we have been thinking with Susan Schuppli, but also like in a continuous engagement into the question of technology. Something that was extremely important for Farocki. Nora already mentioned that a certain degree of an image literacy, but also you could consider this a techno-visual literacy to be trained and to educate oneself. In that sense, the work by Farocki is like educational works, Lehrstücke in the Brechtian understanding, in the way how images compose our world, compose our understanding, compose our thinking, and are a category of reason, also in a category of thought. I mean, the image as a thought form. And this kind of interest of Farocki always following up the most contemporary, not in the sake for contemporaneity, but rather in the sake of its political impact on society. For example, in his late 60s, he would start to engage into the computational image and computer-generated images, because that's something that he saw with the children of his co-workers. I would like to come to the question of collaboration, something extremely important for Farocki as much as for Susan Schuppli's work. And in this kind of spirit, the Farocki Institute is on one side really looking closely into the archival material of the research that Farocki has done for the films, but also really collaborate a lot, like with Kevin, with Susan, on the work. So that perhaps is this like a good intro for like to release or Susan to start your presentation.
Hopefully you can hear me, because I can't really hear I can't hear Nora and Doreen very well. It cuts in and out. Are we okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, just a quick thank you to everybody, and especially Kevin. I really enjoyed our preliminary conversations. What I thought I would do is just play a couple of clips from the Listening to Ice documentary that was shot with the collaborative research team a few years ago in northern India, in the Karakoram range of the Himalayas, at Rangdrung Glacier, and also in various mountain villages throughout the region of Ladakh that are experiencing extreme water scarcity due to glacial recession. So in the Himalayas, there are about 50 villages that are on the verge of disappearing because the sources of water upon which they rely are also disappearing. So the issues around the retreat of glaciers caused by obviously global warming or global burning, are very different in Southeast Asia than in the Arctic regions. So I thought I would pull the clips just from this one particular project, also because it foregrounds the acoustic. So, and just to say, I'm not here representing forensic architecture. This is not a project pursued under the framework of the Investigative Human Rights Agency. I'm affiliated and one of the people that was there at the beginning when the agency was founded. But I have always had to develop a different aesthetic and visual language to tell the stories that I'm interested in telling, because I'm not trying to create evidence that will then go into some sort of criminal or proceeding, etc. I'm trying to tell a complex set of stories around the impacts of climate change in different cryospheric contexts. There's a lot of research happening in Switzerland, of course, in relationship to what is happening with material, and some of the visuals may be familiar for those of you who've spent any time in mountain environments. Let's just play two clips. The first is a group of villagers, mostly women, from a village called Akshau near Drang, are just we're listening to the actual sounds of the glacier receding, melting through these moulins, which are large sort of wormholes that are carved by water and ice. And these wormholes, they literally drill down through the various strata of glaciers, hundreds of thousands of years. And so we ran various workshops with a local grassroots organization called Local Futures based in Leh. And so one of the things we did was a deep listening kind of workshop. So the first clip is from that, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second after we've watched it. And the second clip is just more a discussion of what we're trying to do with our various acoustic methods at Drang Drang Glacier. So let's just play those two clips right now, and then I can say a few words, and Doreen, of course, has some questions she might want to raise. Thanks. So yeah, if you can play the first clip, that would be terrific. Thank you. Yeah, that was my mistake. Yeah, we played clip 2 first, which is great. That's what I wanted. And now if you can play the slightly longer one.
Are you coming back?
The project Listening to Ice is trying to understand the phenomena and the condition of climate change through the acoustic register. So we're in this extraordinary environment here in northern India at the Drang Drang Glacier, and we're about to go out into this glacier lake. Here we have various hydrophones, and so what we're going to try and do this afternoon is use our hydrophones to find the most acoustically dynamic and lively parts of the lake, which will give us some indication as to the activity and the behavior of the glacier, which of course is undergoing kind of rapid transformations because of climate change and global warming. Once we do that, we're actually going to lower a long-term acoustic instrument, and that instrument can, in principle, acquire real-time data over a period of 6 months. that sensor will then sit at the bottom of this glacial lake, and when it's retrieved, we'll look at that data and we'll try and determine the acoustic signature, if you will, of this glacier. So every glacier that terminates in a water body produces a very specific acoustic signature, and then once we have that sort of baseline acoustic cartography, then we can monitor the lake and activities over the course of many years to understand the changes that are taking place within the glacier. So when you're shooting in these kinds of contexts, in some ways we could say they're very familiar kinds of images that get produced. The camera and the lenses that you use, they look at these environmental systems in particular kind of ways, but it's not always that easy or, let's say, straightforward to really, when you're working within a sort of a mountainous kind of environmental system, and the scale of the materials that you're develop perhaps an entirely different or visual sort of repertoire. So I've really had to rely on sound to somehow bring an added dimension to the visuals so that we're not simply looking at a kind of nature documentary. I've really tried to use the sound to register sometimes a certain sense of anxiety, or to register some sort of unease, to suggest that something else is going on in these very transformative geographies that doesn't always present itself as visual information. So I've had to use the sound in post-production. As I said, oftentimes mixing the environmental field recordings that I do, bringing a sound designer on board, where we work very often with a sort of pushing with the sort of bringing in a kind of electronic kind of track, not so much in this listening to ice, but it's certainly there in particular kinds of places. So we have the use of sound as a tool to investigate climate change. We have the use of field recordings, or sort of ambient field recordings, to add another layer of kind of information over the image track. Then there's the sound in post-production, but there's also the activities of sounding the glacier, like sonifying the glacier itself. There's practices not just of listening by technical means. There's also the stories that mountain villagers were telling us about the world that is changing around them. So there's intergenerational knowledge that gets, that one of the ways in which that is passed along is through various storytelling or oral traditions, or simply like the speaking of observations from lived experience, of daily observations of everyday life that people were telling us. So in this particular project, I really wanted to use sound to open up multiple kind of like tracks, if you will, both like visual, audio tracks, visual tracks, but also sort of conceptual and informational tracks. And so I really understood that acoustics, or this idea of sound, as the thing that sort of linked these different sort of strata that we're trying to develop in the kind of project. And just to say that, of course, anyone who's familiar with the work of Pauline Oliveras knows that deep listening as a method of intentional sustained and durational kind of listening to an environmental system has a very powerful and well-established history. So when we talked about deep listening at the glacier is more about the sort of listening into deep time, because we were literally listening to the sounds of glacial melt from hundreds of thousands of years ago. So it was a bit of it wasn't deep listening in the Pauline Oliveira sense of the term, which is this attenuated, incredibly, it's a kind of listening where you're not just listening casually, but you're listening with a kind of very specific, intensified sort of intentionality. And so we were doing a little bit of that with the villagers, but it was more the idea of using listening to listen to the deep sort of sonorous properties of the earth itself. But maybe, Doreen, why don't you jump in with some comments?
Yeah, thank you. It's I will just really connect directly to Susan. Thank you so much to this kind of sound as an analytical tool or as an investigative tool and deep listening as a methodology that allows us to think the practice that Susan has been following up to contemplate about a post-human video ontology of the 21st century in the age of the Anthropocene. So something what I've learned really most also of Susan's work, as much as also from Farocki's work and other filmmakers like Black Audio Collective or the Autolit Group, is how the image itself changes according to planetary kind of profound transformations. So I think this is really at the core of the work. It's a very comprehensive work, the research that Susan has been doing with listening to ice. It's like a whole network of projects in different regions, and we have been listening now and engaging with the research that Susan, I think, has done with a research team. This mode of collaboration I also really would like to point out as a profound research-based practice in the north of India, I think in 2021, and I think the film came out, or the video essay came out in 2023, but there are many, many more. Please check the website. So why I'm saying this, because this kind of video ontology, what does the video image or the image politics look like in the age of the Anthropocene if we are going through profound planetary changes, a climate breakdown? And if sound is a kind of an investigative tool, then ice is what Gabriele Hecht would have considered an interscalar vehicle. Susan, you have talked quite a lot about scale, the scaling of time, but also the scaling of a very precise location towards a planetary network. The climate breakdown on a planetary kind of scale shows itself very concretely in the melting of the glaciers, for example, in the north of India. So if sound, and this is also here more an acousmatic voice, because we don't see quite the source of where the sound is coming from in terms of, you know, that we see the like precise source of the dropping water, but rather the ice becomes the echo chamber. It's like a loudspeaker at kind of a Cosmo technique. This is something I really would like to elaborate further, but I think we don't have the time. Cosmotechnics in the sense of Yukoi, who has proposed a quite profound understanding of the role of art in terms of a philosophy of technology that is enveloping and crafting our like condition of subjects living, you know, as planetary subjects. So to come back to the sound as a kind of as a tool is because why is this kind of really paradigm shifting? Usually in research that we engage with in academia and university, we are really trained to look into disciplines. Of course, this is all quite also opening up. But how do we engage with an 80,000 years old deep time? So if Susan proposes the methodology of deep listening, and Susan said it's connected to a deep time, a deep history, a deep research, a slow research, a collaborative research, this deep listening, what we see in the work by Susan, is a social practice, is a transgenerational practice, it's a pedagogical practice. I mean, this is what I connect with, you know, when we engage in the work and trying to understand what does this methodology need and what does it allow. It needs this kind of collaboration, social interaction, but also it is what I think Florian this morning would say, listening as a mode of discourse production. So, this I think is a huge challenge. It's really one of the largest challenge. How does the image and, you know, change, and what is the limit of the image as a visual category? Where do we have to listen to images? And this also, thank you, Florian, this morning, I think, or was it, Erika was invoking Tina M. Kamp's listening to images, but also Fred Moten's the phonic substance of images, where looking at images also is a sonic experience, is a phonic experience. And I think the work by Susan and her team, and it's like elaborating this kind of para-visual, or that what goes beyond the visual, in kind of a Eurocentric sense. The visual always has contained inscription of sound. I mean, if you would even want to go back to Roland Barthes' understanding of photography, that always there is an imprint of the very condition of the moment an image is taken into the film material. Of course, this kind of is changing in the digital kind of condition. But this is what, you know, this kind of listening, deep listening to images is a form of deep listening, like elaborated in the work. And in that sense, I think this is also another works by Susan, and I'm going to finish soon. We feel so pressured here because we have to really finish in time, and we started 10 minutes later. That in quite a few works that you can really engage with, where eyes is an archive, eyes is a form of historical materialism, kind of a world memory that encapsulates a time scale that goes beyond, beyond the scale of human time. This is how deep time is kind of defined. A geological time reaches beyond the human scale. And this is the reason why I would like to situate or pose the question, maybe this could be something to have a conversation together, in which way we need to live in ontological term when it comes to the question of the image and when it comes to the question of future cinema. The ontological turn that, you know, we are living through in terms of technology and irreconcilable kind of changes, what the Anthropocene is kind of suggesting. What kind of impact does it have in our understanding of the image, and what kind of urgency does it propose to reflect and rethink our practices? And I think this is exactly where a research-based practice comes in, and maybe just to finish on that point, because it connects us again to the work of Harun Farocki, the mode of collaboration that Susan's work very much like really builds on collaboration with sound designers, with glaciologists, with geologists, and Didi Sheka, a researcher and artist from Lagos who is building up there the archive, coined the term of the accidentally archivist. And I would suggest that Susan's practice is proposing that we need to become an accidental scientist. The second clip that we have been looking at is listening to eyes, is where Susan herself is explaining, introducing into the conditions of the research. You could say it's an interlocutor, it's a commentator of that what we see, but it also is a transformation of the artist's researcher and that what we consider an accidental scientist. And this I would connect with Harun to some extent. There are so many works of his in the late 90s when he engaged in prison images and iris scan technology, and I thought I was seeing convicts, to be in conversation with scientists, with researchers, with a whole range of competences and practices that are necessary in order to propose a project that allows us to understand the condition we are living in through a very specific lens. And I feel pressured, but we still have, I think, a bit, we have like 7 minutes, I think. or maybe 10 minutes. And I have to skip the cosmotechnics part, which is really a shame. But you know, we can do this maybe later on with Fritz and conversations. But maybe you would like to have.
We have a little more time, but yeah.
Okay, great. And Susan, can you hear also us a bit like what I've been trying to offer in reflection, but also maybe there are some questions in the audience?
I mean, I did hear you, Doreen. The one thing that I would just say quickly, maybe it would also help with audience questions, was, yeah, when you use the term acousmatic sound, so it was a very social set of circumstances, surprisingly social. The time that we spent together on the glacier with the scientists, with the villagers, with the local activists, etc., and placing our ears to the moulin and listening to the ice became a very enthralling and exciting and enchanting kind of an experience. It wasn't this sort of voice of Dr. Mabuse or the voice in the Wizard of Oz. The source of the sound didn't conjure some sort of inexplicable sense of dread and fear. It was precisely the opposite. And people started describing the sound as the sound of boiling tea, or they could hear a helicopter whirling, that type of thing. So the sounds that were emanating from within the glacier immediately became part of the familiar and domesticated environments that people were familiar with. And for me, that sociality was really kind of important. And I felt that those kinds of experiences shifted the project from the kinds of sounds that we often see in relationship to films about the calving and the breaking of an ice sheet in Antarctica, like this massive chunk of ice that is going to plummet into the water and throw up these huge kind of tidal waves and this incredible kind of thunderous sounds. Everything in this project there was a kind of like sound, although powerful, wasn't operating in this mode of drama. It was operating as a site of sort of social exchange and laughter even, in fact, and sort of wondrous kind of like fascination. And I think that the microphones and the hydrophones opened up and gave people access to sounds that, say, technicians normally only would hear and data scientists might analyze. It created an experience for people that somehow carried some of the stakes that were operating in the sort of scientific kind of realm. So I think that's really important, but I really appreciate your making that very important point to me about the sort of listening to a sound where you don't necessarily see the source and how that operates. And I think that's a really great insight. So maybe I'll leave it there so there's enough time for others to involve themselves in the conversation.
Thank you. Are there remarks or questions from the audience?
Yeah, sorry, I'm a bit shy because it's kind of like a half-shaped question or thought, but just like I just find this talk, I just found this talk so inspiring, and also this notion of how the act of listening opens up different scales. You talked about deep time, deep listening as related to deep time. And this is something that I always found very fascinating and also frightening to some extent, to think also about the threshold of what is audible for human beings, and how that relates to geological times, but also to the climate and to what is happening that is greater than us, that goes beyond us, so that's why my question isn't really there yet, but I was just wondering, and this is a question to Susan and also to Doreen and Nora, like how does your work also in a way relate to this threshold of like how do we relate to these like ultrasounds that we cannot hear, but that in a way are also signaling the like our scale in relation to a greater environment. I don't know if, yeah, sorry, this is not a really clear question.
No, don't apologize. I think that's a fantastic kind of question, and it's really kind of fundamental when you have an audiovisual kind of practice dealing with thresholds. And of course, yeah, you're absolutely right. There's so many things happening beyond the threshold of human perception. And in some way, I think for me, that's been really emphasized when I've spent time in the Arctic, in fact. And I was with a glaciologist circumnavigating Spitsbergen Island on a small sailboat. And there would be days where we literally only saw water, ice, and sky. And I would have to force myself into reminding myself that, you know, so much was happening in this far northern environment, you know, like the kind of the intensification of military intelligence gathering that is happening in the electromagnetic spectrum as you get close to the North Pole is substantial. But of course, also the Russian and also UK nuclear, the Trident submarine fleet is moving under the Arctic ice, etc. So much of the sort of geopolitical reality is also not perceptible sometimes when one is in these environments. And how, as a filmmaker, do you start to, like, how do you sort of in some way bring that which can't be perceived through like the auditory or visual channels that are perceptible to humans into some sort of presence, I think is a really crucial challenge. But then I think there's so much amazing work in the field of bioacoustics that people like Bernie Krause and others are doing, that they can really demonstrate how sound is such a valuable tool for like climate change work, but also showing us how like species degradation within the biosphere, how those changes can really register themselves acoustically, but we don't necessarily see them. We might think that a forest that has been selectively logged is a more sort of is a better way to manage sort of contemporary kind of a contemporary forest, but if you listen to that forest, you'll see that whole frequency ranges of different insect groups have dropped out. So we can only understand those changes sonically by analyzing spectrograms, but by doing frequency analysis. And it's not something we would ever see, because what we see is actually a well-managed, more environmentally sympathetic mode of forest management. But the acoustic tells us that even despite that, there's still been a kind of dramatic impact on insect ecology. So I think that all the work that's been developed through using acoustics has really opened up a really kind of important dimension into the world and work of Earth scientists. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Susan. And thank you very much for this wonderfully complex presentation. Similarly to Sylvia, I think I have a half-formed question that I hope I'll be able to form as I speak, that has to do with threshold indeed, but also with scale. One thing that I keep hitting against in my own thinking and research about the gap between the human scale and, you know, the call it deep scale, be it in terms of space or in terms of extension or time and duration is the question of how can we, with human tools or with the human sensorial apparatus and the tools that we develop to extend the capacity of that apparatus, form a solid trace of that deeper time. It's this paradox of you know, the light that we receive from the sky might be sourced 8 years ago or 20 seconds ago, and depending on the distance of a planet or star. And the sound, I don't know. Susan, you said something that, if I'm not wrong, I found really interesting, is a glacier as a reservoir of sound. And I can imagine that as, you know, a solid formation of water, it has a glacier has properties of propagation and maybe conservation of sonic traces that you can't find in liquid mediums. I still don't know how to form my question. It has to do with how concrete and demonstrable we can build a sonic trace of a time passed in a glacier, maybe? Maybe that's a question that's specific enough?
Well, that's an amazingly provocative kind of question.
I'm sorry,
Like
I'm
sonic
just trying to think.
No, I like the idea of the sonic trace. Because, you know, to be perfectly honest, the scientists, and this, now I'm talking about Grant Dean and Oscar Glowacki, who really pioneered the use of acoustic monitoring of glaciers, that they have to terminate in water. So they're called marine terminating glaciers. In the Himalayas, they almost always terminate in a glacial lake. So that was very, that worked for our purposes. And so what we were measuring was basically melt rate, the patterns that, say, the air that is being released, that's been, you know, compressed in ice, and as the ice melts, it releases gases, and those gases we can measure the frequency rate of those gases, etc. And you could build up an acoustic cartography of that glacier over time. You would have to do this for multiple years, and you would really understand the changes in the patterns and dynamics of, say, calving, melt, etc., etc. So this is the way that it's done sort of technically, is this, you know, sustained year upon year. That is how you would build up an acoustic signature, which is, I think, what I used the term in the film for an actual glacier. And then you do comparative analysis. But what you're asking is in some way a more philosophical or conceptual question about whether we could somehow track, how do you track sound through time? Because we can see the ways in which we can see the scraped, you know, we can see geological time. You know, you can see the scraping as a glacier moves, it leaves these huge scrape marks in the landscape. So we have a sense of the movement and the movement of that glacier over time by the traces it carves in the earth. But it's interesting for me, and I don't have an answer, but I'd like to think with you and think with this question: how could we think about like sonic traces that are somehow captured in ice, giving us some sort of access to the time, through like access to time through sort of through an acoustic kind of register. Yeah, I think incredibly kind of fascinating to imagine if that's actually what's happening with the work that we were trying to do, that we're actually also producing a kind of sonic archive in some way. Yeah, really interesting. Thank you so much.
Craig.
I was wondering, this is a question maybe for Nora and Doreen also, perhaps. I wanted to come back to Faroki. And I'm wondering, I don't know if you would agree with me, but I feel as of late, not a moment, but sound studies are sort of having a number of moments in scholarship. Scholars are paying more attention to sound, and it's sort of the renewed importance of listening is becoming more apparent. There's a lot of great things that are happening in the field. And I'm wondering, how would you, I guess, bridge the gap between what you were speaking about with Faroki and this need to sort of listen to images, even though most of us, when we understand Faroki, we understand them as being sort of hyper-focused on the image as sort of a visual quality, and to bring that into Susan's work and other work like hers in terms of dealing with actual sound and actual sort of sound waves and the material properties and the sonic properties. So I'm wondering, how is there a gap to be bridged? I guess what can we sort of learn from each side to sort of move closer? Should sound studies be more in dialogue with visual studies that would say listen to these images, or what does that actually mean? I would love to hear a bit more of your thoughts on that rambling question I tried to ask.
I'm going to provide you with an equally rambling answer. As somebody who has been working in sound for a very long time, I did something called Sound Matters, a book, 2 decades ago, and watching how the field has developed. And I think what I'm most interested in, something we talked about a little bit last night, is what I would call like how sound is used actually architecturally, how sound will then sculpt a space in which images are placed, and looking particularly sort of when one places images, hangs images, and how the sound often is working, and this would get to the idea of the inaudible, even if you cannot hear it. So in the case of Faroki, it's kind of striking the way his films sort of downplay, no pun intended, the sound, but I would argue that the sound exists there as an architecture to structure the images, to structure the sequences. So when he's dealing with distance montage, for example, of Pelagian, where certain images keep recurring, it's not entirely random, but it's following a musical structure. And I would say that that is happening a lot more than we want to acknowledge when people are editing images, that they're listening to music often, or that musical piece is deeply affecting how they are building their visual work.
Yeah, maybe to add what Nora just said, Harun was an extremely precise listener when you would have a conversation with him. I mean, he was really most attentive, he would remember. And, I mean, it's not that in Faroki's work we have like some research into the sonic, like as a category in itself or as a research environment, but sound, as Nora just said, really plays a critical role through voicing, through voices, through pauses, through listening to each other, through dialogues. And I think what you said, Craig, regarding like sound studies, I think this is another kind of urgency that seems to be really elaborated in terms of what do we do when we reach the limits of the image as a kind of a category of visualization. If we all understand and we all know that history, for example, or deep time is not only composed of like the visual category as an optic vision, it goes beyond vision. And I think this is another kind of process to create a discourse around images that goes beyond the image and where the sonic, becomes a very important resource. But I mean, just like commenting on Faroki's capacity to listen really carefully. So I think sound really played a critical role, but not in the way as we would like to take this as a subject or as a, an object to discuss. It's rather a condition to work with. Maybe that more anecdotal, but it tells a lot about Farocki's practice. Thank you. Well, I think this is maybe a good moment if there are not further comments, remarks, and echoes, resonances from the presentations. Thank you everyone for joining in. Thank you, Kevin, for putting together this panel, you coming in here, and the team, and also Susan for being here virtually. We've missed you a lot, but it was a great conversation, and we will continue otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Doreen, and the Harun Farocki Institute for making this possible. Thank you, Nora, for your remarkable work with, through, and beyond Harun Farocki. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This concludes the public encounters for the conference Cinema Futures, Future of Survival. I'm really, really grateful for your attention over these last 3 days. Thank you so much. Have a great evening, everybody.